All right, welcome back, everyone. So, what about this topic? What are the Dark Ages? And so, this is a term that actually comes up more than once. Very often, we talk about "quote unquote" the Dark Ages, which I'm going to explain in a second, which is usually associated with the fall of the Roman Empire period. But actually, it's a term that is used in history for other periods as well. And so I want to talk about what we mean by a dark age and then talk about the dark ages that we often refer to during the fall of Rome and maybe explain to you that they're not quite as dark as many people think they are. So what do we mean by a dark ages in general? So let me explain this. The way I like to describe dark ages, and different historians will explain this differently, but for me at the core of it is you're in a dark age when the characteristics of civilizations disappear. So then the question is, well, what are the characteristics of civilization? And so, the term Dark Ages, the Dark Ages for Roman, was actually coined by a man named Petrarch around the 1300s AD, when he looked around the period of the fall of Rome and said, which was much earlier, 476 AD, and said, they were kind of in a decline and they were lacking the advances that you had in Rome. Now, in terms of characteristics of civilization, those are things like writing and monumental architecture, political organization, use of metal, occupational specialization. I have a whole lecture that goes into a lot more detail on this, a much longer lecture that gives a lot of detail on all this. But when you start to see those things either disappearing or declining dramatically, very often you might call it a dark age. So one period of time of dark age actually is around the year 1100 BC, around 1200, 1100 BC, around the Mediterranean Sea, there was a dark age. Some people refer to this as the Greek Dark Ages, which was much, much earlier. And, I always tell people, is it completely a dark age? No, because there were things happening. Sometimes it's a dark age because we simply don't have enough research and have done enough information to know what's going on. But is there a decline of events in writing and monumental architecture? Absolutely. But the classic version of the Dark Age is when you refer to the fall of Rome. So, for those who are not familiar, again, I have a lot of lectures on the Roman Empire you could watch on my channel. But the Roman world goes from 753 BC traditionally all the way until the year 476 AD. And by 476 AD, Rome, of course, was an empire. And in 476 AD, the Roman Empire collapses, right? It is the fall of the Roman Empire. And when that happens, people say, okay, we entered the Dark Age. But there are a few really important things that I want you to get, these takeaways about when we talk about the fall of Rome in the Dark Ages. So first one is when you talk about the fall of Rome, you're not even talking about the entire Roman Empire. In fact, the entire western part of Rome, yes, kind of, and this is not exact, the lines, of course, falls into a dark age. The eastern part of Rome over here, that remains and thrives in what we call the Byzantine Empire. So it's only in the West. When you talk about the term the Dark Ages in 476, it's really only in Western Rome. And that happens as a result of all these various Germanic tribes coming in. And again, I have other lectures that go into a lot more detail on this. And basically, instead of having one united western part of Rome, it's fragmented among these various tribes like the Franks and the Lombards and the Angles and the Saxons and so forth. So that's one. Number two, it didn't happen overnight. It's not as though you go to bed in 475 and you're living in a glorious Roman world, and then 476 everything just turns dark, right? In the West even, right? It's a gradual thing. You can go all the way back to what we sometimes call the crisis of the 3rd century, when Rome was already struggling and they were already seeing a decline, and then they recover a bit, and then boom, 476, it all ends. The other thing is, even when you talk about the West, and even when you talk about the decline, it's not fully a dark age. It is not as though it's not as though all of a sudden everything is gone in what was the Western Roman world. Yes, you don't have a united Western Roman Empire anymore, but if you look at the history of the Franks and the Visigoths and these other powers, they did have writing. They did have political organization. Eventually, you get to the year 800 AD, for example, which many people still consider part of the Dark Ages. I usually don't anymore. Kind of when I talk about the Dark Ages, I say 476 to 800. A lot of people want to take it all the way to the year 1000 AD. But my point is, by 800 AD, you have something called the Carolingian Renaissance inside of what was the area of Gaul here that eventually becomes ruled over for the Franks, and during the time of Charlemagne, again, I have a whole bunch of lectures on that as well. So you have the Carolingian Renaissance, you have schools that are going to develop and more writing, and so there are things happening. And even before that, you go to the 500s and you have primary sources. We have people writing like Gregory of Tours and other writers as well. So, it's an interesting term because people want to call it just a dark age, but it's not, right? There are things happening. I always do say there is definitely a decline, right? I don't want to say it's as glorious and as strong as what the Western Roman Empire was, but it was not the complete just destruction of all thoughts and ideas. There are things happening. And then you can even get to the point where, if you're talking about the entire region, the entire map you see here, in the East during this time, there is tremendous things happening, both in the Byzantine Empire and then, in the Islamic world as well. If you look at, powers like the Umayyads and the Abbasids, if you're not familiar with them, there was flourishing in chemistry and science and mathematics. A lot of stuff's going on. So when you're talking about these kind of Middle Ages, and again, that's another term worth noting, is that this is all during the beginning of the Middle Ages. That I tell my students the first part of the Middle Ages are the Dark Ages. There's actually a lot of stuff happening. So yeah, there is a decline, but it's not a complete obliteration of everything. So there you go. So you kind of hopefully understand from this short video what we mean by a dark age, kind of a decline, but also understand now it's not completely a dark age. And there were others. As I said, there was one all the way back around 1100 BC around the Greek world that we see a dark age as well. So it is a term we see in other times and places as well. All right, I hope you found that was interesting. Again, there's a lot more information on these various topics on my other lectures, whether you want to learn about the Franks a little bit more, or Rome, a lot of stuff I have that you can kind of explore and learn about. All right, thank you. I hope you all found that interesting. Have a great day. That's it. Bye.